take a look at where we left off yesterday. So yesterday we discussed maintaining session on the server, and we introduced the Express Session API. Right? It's a library that allows us to maintain data on the server keyed off of the cookie that a client might provide. And to illustrate the examples on how to use it, we created these 3 HTTP endpoints where we can pass in a name-value pair and then use the session, right, that is available through the request, right, and we can treat it as a map, and then use the key of the name and store the value that we pass in through the URL. Later in a subsequent query, we can try and get the information that we had stored in the session. Right? We can provide the name of the key that we had stored in the map, right? And then we can return it again using the session, using it now as a read operation, where we're using the key to read the value and then return that value. So we illustrated how we can write to the session and read from the session, right? And the values that we're storing are independent, or they're different depending on who is using it from which browser, right? So if I'm accessing from a browser and I set a value like a zip code or a shopping cart, and that will be keyed off of the cookie that I provide, as opposed to someone else accessing the same application from some other browser. So we illustrated that, and then we showed how we could use those ideas, right, to implement a user management system where folks could register, right? They could register and create a new user, right? And they could then come back later to log in with that same user that they had registered as, and then anyway, you could always retrieve the current logged in user. Right? So both register and login would create a new user either coming from the browser or finding the user from the database. And if it found it, then it would set a current user in the session. We also illustrated how to use logout. So the implementation for register was to retrieve the new user from the body that was being passed, including the username and password, and then we would insert it into the database. Right? Once we insert it into the database, we could then store that user in the session. Right? Later on, as we navigate through the profile or navigate throughout the website, we can always go back and retrieve from the current user, from this endpoint, and retrieve who the current user is. Right? And then we can use that logic on the client to decide whether we navigate from one place to another, or show or hide certain content which is private or public, right? And then eventually we can log out and just disable that session, right? Right. So we demonstrated only the server side, right? And it'd be nice to have a client side application, maybe an Angular application or a React application that could use this API to log in.